Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is standing outside in the cold, alone, lighting a cigarette, and feeling guilty about it. Maybe that's you. Maybe it's someone you love. Maybe it's a coworker you've silently judged 100 times through the window. And here's the story everyone has been told their whole life. Smoking is a modern mistake, a 20th century addiction, something big tobacco invented, packaged, and sold to a generation that didn't know better. Something that started with jazz, clubs, and Hollywood glamour and doctors who hadn't yet read the research. Our recent problem, a fixable problem. A problem that just requires enough willpower, enough warning labels, enough graphic photos on cigarette packs. That story is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not off by a decade or two. Fundamentally, completely wrong. And once you see the real timeline, the actual evidence, you will never look at a cigarette or the person holding one the same way again. Because here's what nobody tells you. Smoking may be older than language itself. Let that sit. Older than the wheel, older than farming, older than the first city ever built, the first law ever written, the first god ever named. And I'm not asking you to take that on faith. The evidence is real, physical, scientific. It's sitting in caves in Guatemala. It's preserved in the DNA of plants that traveled with humans across frozen continents. It's burned into the walls of temples that were ancient, when the Roman Empire was still young. It's buried in the teeth of people who died thousands of years before your civilization had a name. But before we get to any of that, I need you to understand something that changes this entire conversation. Why does this behavior exist at all? Not, why do people smoke today? We know that answer. Addiction, marketing, stress, social habit. But why did the very first human, in a world without tobacco companies, without peer pressure, without any cultural expectation whatsoever, why did a person choose to breathe smoke on purpose? To answer that, we have to go back much further than most people expect. We have to start with fire. Fire changed everything about what it means to be human. Long before anyone planted a crop, built a wall, or scratched a symbol into clay, our ancestors learned to control flames. And the evidence for how long ago this happened is genuinely staggering. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire used by human ancestors comes from a site called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Inside that cave, archaeologists found burnt plant ash and charred animal bone, not scattered randomly the way wildfire. Debris would be contained, deliberate, sustained. That site dates back roughly 1 million years. 1 million years ago, there were no Homo sapiens. The creature sitting beside that fire was Homo erectus, our earlier ancestor, with a heavier brow, a smaller brain, and hands that had never touched anything we would recognize as technology. And every single day, that creature breathed smoke. Not because it wanted to, because there was no way around it. If you sat near fire, and you had to sit near fire to survive the night, you inhaled smoke. That was simply the condition of being alive. For hundreds of thousands of years, smoke was as normal as breathing. And then something happened. Something small. Something that probably didn't even register as significant in the moment. Someone noticed that not all smoke felt the same. Here's something that almost never gets mentioned in conversations about smoking. When you burn organic material, you don't just produce carbon dioxide and water vapor. You produce a complex chemical cocktail that varies completely depending on what is burning. And some plants, when combusted, release psychoactive compounds, alkaloids, terpenes, chemicals that interact directly with the human nervous system in ways that are, to put it mildly, noticeable. Which means that at some point, sitting around a prehistoric campfire, one of your ancestors accidentally inhaled smoke from the wrong plant and felt something, not sick, not poisoned, different, sharper maybe, or calmer or more alert, or like the fear sitting in their chest had suddenly, inexplicably loosened its grip. And here's the moment that started everything. That ancestor remembered. They came back to that plant. They burned it again. They paid attention. And slowly, across generations of trial and error and accumulated observation, a pattern emerged. This plant does something. This smoke changes the mind. This is worth keeping. This is how almost all ancient human knowledge worked. Not through writing, not through schools, through lived experience, passed mouth to ear, generation to generation, around fires burning in the dark. That process, curiosity meeting repetition, meeting memory, may be the true origin of smoking, not a grand discovery, Not a single moment of invention, just a human being paying attention, then teaching someone else what they noticed. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely shocking. Because when archaeologists started looking for physical evidence of intentional smoke inhalation, actual proof that ancient humans were deliberately using plants this way, what they found pushed the timeline back far beyond anything anyone expected. In 2020, a research team working in the Escalante Desert of southwestern Utah made a discovery that quietly rewrote human history. At a site called Wishbone, a small ancient hearth in the desert, researchers found something buried in the ash alongside the bones of birds and fish and the charred remains of other seeds. 4 seeds. Seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species. The hearth was dated to 12,300 years before present. Now stop and think about what that number actually means. 12,300 years ago, agriculture did not exist. The first permanent human settlements were still thousands of years in the future. Glaciers from the last ice age were still retreating across North America. And yet, in what is now the Utah desert, a human being was deliberately placing tobacco into a fire. Deliberately. Because here is the detail that makes this undeniable. There was no evidence of tobacco growing naturally anywhere in that region at that time. Those seeds did not blow in from a nearby field. There were no nearby fields. There was no nearby tobacco. Someone had carried those seeds across a significant distance. Someone had kept them, protected them, brought them to this specific place, and then placed them intentionally into the flames. Darren Duke, the lead researcher on that project, told reporters that the discovery pushed back the known timeline of tobacco used by thousands of years, that the relationship between humans and tobacco was far more ancient and complex than anyone previously thought. He was being careful, scientific, measured. What he found was civilizational, but even 12,300 years is not where this story begins. This is the part that most people never hear. In 2018, a research team at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew published findings from a genetic study of wild tobacco species across North and South America. They traced the phylogenetic lineage, the family tree of tobacco, varieties across the entire continent. What they found was not what anyone expected. The genetic spread of tobacco varieties across the Americas almost perfectly mirrors the known migration routes of early humans into the continent. Read that again slowly. The plant didn't just happen to grow everywhere humans settled. Humans appear to have carried the seeds with them, which means that when your ancestors were crossing the land bridge between Asia and North America, walking through frozen tundra in animal skins, navigating by stars, hunting mammoths and giant ground sloths that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Some of them had tobacco seeds in their pouches during the Ice Age. This was not a casual relationship. This was not a plant someone stumbled upon. This was a plant that humans had decided thousands of years before the concept of agriculture existed was worth carrying across continents. Think about what you would carry if you were walking into an unknown frozen wilderness with everything you owned on your back. Food, fire-starting materials, tools, weapons, clothing, and apparently tobacco. So the question that should be sitting in your mind right now is this: why? What made this plant so important that people carried it across the world? To answer that, I need to tell you something about your own brain. Something that explains not just ancient tobacco use, but why 1.3 billion people are still using it today, despite knowing exactly what it does to them. Nicotine, the active compound in tobacco, does not bind to a receptor in your brain that evolved to accommodate it. It hijacks a receptor that evolved for something else entirely. The nicotinic acetylcholine receptor is one of the oldest systems in the human nervous system. It regulates attention, arousal, muscle coordination, memory formation, and, crucially, the fight or flight response. In evolutionary terms, this system existed for one purpose: survival. Sharpened your senses when a predator was nearby. It narrowed your focus when the situation demanded complete concentration. It flooded your nervous system with stimulation precisely calibrated to make you faster, sharper, more alert in moments of danger. When nicotine enters your bloodstream, it doesn't create a new pathway. Whilst directly into one of the most ancient pathways in your entire nervous system, a pathway that has existed for millions of years, and activates it. In 2016, research published in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology demonstrated that nicotine's effect on this receptor system is functionally identical in modern humans and in primates who have never been exposed to tobacco in their lives. The system wants stimulation. It has always wanted stimulation, and for tens of thousands of years, tobacco was simply one of the most efficient ways ever discovered to deliver it. That craving, the one that smokers describe as almost physical. Almost like hunger is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is not the manufactured result of clever advertising. Though advertising absolutely made it worse. It is your oldest survival system recognizing something it has known for a very, very long time. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most people never expect. Because across the ancient world, across every culture that ever had access to tobacco or similar plants, smoking was almost never recreational. It was sacred. Go back to Guatemala. In 2021, researchers found ancient murals, pottery fragments, and residue testing positive for nicotine compounds at a cave site called Cueva del Maíz, dating to approximately 2,600 years ago. The context was unmistakably ritual. Sacred space, not a home, not a market, a place set apart. The oldest surviving written documents from Mesoamerica, the Maya codices, depict gods smoking. Not ordinary people, not farmers or merchants or soldiers, gods. Research at ceremonial sites in North Carolina found tobacco residue specifically at locations used for ritual gatherings, not in everyday domestic spaces where people cooked and slept and lived their ordinary lives. And in the Amazon, anthropologist Johannes Wilbert spent decades documenting something remarkable. Across more than 90 indigenous South American cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by thousands of miles of jungle and mountain, tobacco was not a vice. It was a technology, a tool for healing, for altered states of consciousness, for communication with forces beyond ordinary human perception, for marking the thresholds of birth and death, and war and peace. The Huichol of Mexico, the Shipibo of Peru, the Lakota of the Great Plains, the Haudenosaunee of the Northeast, culture after culture, continent after continent, millennium after millennium, all arriving independently at the same conclusion. This plant opens something. This smoke carries something. This is not ordinary. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you. Those cultures, the ones that used tobacco, ritually and carefully for thousands of years, did not have a lung cancer epidemic. They did not have the withdrawal cycles and the failed quit attempts and the slow suffocation of late-stage emphysema. They did not have the yellowed fingers and the chronic cough and the oncology waiting rooms. Not because the plant was chemically different, because the relationship was different. Tobacco was used sparingly, seasonally, ceremonially, in specific contexts, with specific intentions, handled by specific people who had been trained over years to work with it carefully. The Huichol did not smoke 40 cigarettes a day. The Maya priests inhaling ritual tobacco were not doing it on a 15-minute break from office. They hated. Something changed. And when it changed everything. Around 300 years ago, European colonialism and global trade began, stripping tobacco out of every cultural guardrail that thousands of years of human experience had carefully built around it. Global trade turned it into a commodity. By the late 1800s, the industrially manufactured cigarette had arrived, cheap, convenient, and engineered for maximum consumption. And then the tobacco industry did something that belongs in a different category of human wrongdoing entirely. They knew cigarettes caused cancer. Their own internal scientists told them. Their own internal documents with their own data. And they spent decades and billions of dollars making absolutely certain you didn't find out. They marketed to children. They hired doctors to endorse their products publicly. They added chemical compounds, specifically designed to make nicotine reach the brain faster and leave the system more quickly, maximizing the speed and intensity of the craving cycle. They took something ancient, something that 12,000 years of human culture had treated with reverence and care, and they stripped it of every shred of meaning, every guardrail, every ceremonial boundary, and then they sold it for profit. A shaman using tobacco in 500 BC, and a tobacco executive signing off on marketing to teenagers in 1960. Both worked with the same plant. Almost nothing else about those two situations was the same. Here is what all of this means for the world. we're actually living in. Right now, approximately 1.3 billion people on Earth use tobacco. Tobacco kills roughly 8 million people per year. Those are real deaths, real families, real grief that doesn't go away. And the public health framing that treats smoking as a modern mistake makes sense as a strategy. It names real villains. It gives people a reason to quit. It locates the problem in a specific historical moment with specific people who made specific decisions. But here's the tension that almost nobody in public health ever says out loud. You're asking 1.3 billion people to walk away from a behavior their ancestors practiced for at least 12,300 years. A behavior that is, at the neurochemical level, woven into some of the deepest survival architecture in the human nervous system. You are not just asking someone to put down a cigarette. You are asking them to override a pattern of behavior that has been part of the human experience since before the invention of anything we would recognize as civilization. That doesn't make quitting impossible. Millions of people manage it every year, and it is absolutely worth doing. But it does make the casual contempt, the eye roll at the smoker outside, the quiet superiority of people who have never struggled with it look very different. They are now weak. They are ancient. Consider the numbers one more time, because the contrast is almost absurd when you lay it out plainly. Modern tobacco companies have existed for roughly 150 years. The FDA has regulated tobacco in the United States for about 15 years. The first serious mass public health campaign against smoking began in the 1960s, roughly 60 years ago. 60 years versus 12,300. The behavior is 205 times older than the regulatory framework trying to contain it, and we are genuinely surprised that it persists. Come back one final time to where we started. Someone lighting a cigarette, maybe outside a bar on a cool night, maybe on a porch in the early morning quiet before the rest of the world wakes up. And in that moment, most smokers will tell you this if you ask without judgment. There is something that feels almost meditative. A pause in the noise, a breath, a signal sent somewhere deep in the nervous system. We are here. We survived. We can slow down for a moment. That feeling is not just the nicotine deceiving you. It is the echo of 12,000 years of human beings, reaching for this plant at exactly these kinds of moments. At the edges of difficult things. At the thresholds between ordinary life and something that felt larger. At the places where the noise of the world stopped and something quieter began. Your nervous system remembers. Something your conscious mind has long since forgotten. Every time someone reaches for a cigarette, some ancient part of the brain is reaching for a technology that humans carried across a land. Bridged during the Ice Age, a technology that shamans used to speak across the boundary between worlds, that warriors used to prepare themselves before battle, that healers used to reach patients that ordinary medicine couldn't touch. That is not a metaphor. That is a 12,300-year-old inheritance. The cigarette is a pale, industrial shadow of something that was once treated as profound. And the craving that reaches for it is older than any city, any country, any religion, any written language you have ever encountered. That is not a reason to keep smoking. The modern form, the additives, the engineering, the daily compulsive frequency is genuinely deadly. The people who love you need you here. The health consequences are real and they are serious, and none of this history changes that. But it is absolutely a reason to change how we talk about it. The shame, the sneering, the quiet moral hierarchy that places smokers at the bottom of the ladder of self-control. What we owe each other, what 12,000 years of careful, ritual tradition understood without ever writing it down, is this. This is a powerful thing. This relationship between humans and smoke has always deserved more care than a vending machine and a warning label. The next time you see someone smoking, you are not watching weakness. You are watching something that survived the Ice Age. Something that shamans across a dozen civilizations called sacred. Something your ancestors protected, carefully enough to carry it across frozen continents in the dark. Something that, in its original form, a form that looked nothing like anything sold in a convenience store today, was one of humanity's earliest technologies for managing the unbearable. An extraordinary fact of being conscious in a dangerous world. You are watching the latest chapter in a story that is at least 12,300 years old. That story began not with addiction, not with industry, not with greed. It began with a fire, and a human being paying close enough attention to notice what the smoke was doing. If this made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more deep dives into the ancient roots of things we think are modern, subscribe. We do this every week.